Hey friends, it's Jimmy here with my usual quick reminder to hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to drop a quick comment saying where you're watching from or what you're doing while listening. Picture a medieval market square. A wild man, hairy and unkempt, stands watching a customer bargain with a cobbler. The customer, a young man, insists on buying leather to patch his shoes and demands the cobbler use the strongest stitching possible so they will last him another year. The wild man throws back his head and lets out a sharp, jagged bark of laughter. The customer and the cobbler are so concerned by this outburst that they fetch the man in charge of the town. When the local ruler demands to know what's so funny, the wild man points a grimy finger at the customer. He explains that the young man is worried about his shoes lasting a year, yet he has no idea that he will drown before the sun sets today. This isn't the Disney-fied wizard you know and love. This is the original Merlin, or rather, Myrddin, his inspiration. He isn't a benevolent grandfather figure in blue robes. He's a deranged prophet screaming in the woods. He's one part historic Welsh bard and two parts manic street preacher with a sprinkle of the Lorax tossed in for good measure. This specific anecdote, found in the 12th century text Vita Merlini, captures the essence of the character before he was sanitized for chivalric romances and Victorian tales. The story begins not in a castle, but in the blood-soaked mud of the Old North, modern-day Scotland and northern England, around 573 AD. The historical prototype for Merlin was a man named Myrddin Wilt, which translates from Welsh as the Wild. He was a Welsh bard and retainer to Gwendolen, a chieftain who was slaughtered at the Battle of Arthurian. The trauma of this event shattered Myrddin. Legends say he may have even been responsible for the death of his own nephew during the fighting. Overcome with grief and guilt, he fled into the Caledonian forest. There, he lost his mind and lived as a beast, exposed to the elements and terrified of capture. Through this trauma, he was granted prophetic inspiration born of madness, a concept that is common in Celtic folklore. While the Welsh told stories of Myrddin, the Scots in the same region told stories of a nearly identical figure named Lailechen. Most scholars agree these are the same person, filtered through different linguistic and cultural traditions. Lailechen's story is preserved in the hagiography of St. Kentigern, the patron saint of Glasgow. Lailechen is a wild man of the woods who interrupts the prayers of the saint with shrieking prophecies. He confesses that he is condemned to wander the wilderness because of his sins at the Battle of Arthurian. Two famous stories define Lailechen. The first is the triple death. Lailechen predicts he will die in 3 different ways simultaneously. The locals mock him, saying that it's completely impossible, but the prophecy is fulfilled grimly and accurately, at least with poetic license. He's stoned and beaten by shepherds, falls from a cliff, gets his foot caught in a root, and hangs upside down with his head submerged in the River Tweed. He is beaten, hanged, and drowned all at once. This motif served to validate his prophetic power. No matter how absurd his words seemed, they would always come true. The second story involves the Queen of Strathclyde, Langareth. She gives a ring to her lover, a knight. Her husband, King Ridderk, discovers the infidelity, steals the ring from the knight while he sleeps, and throws it into the River Clyde. He then demands the queen produce it, or face execution. Lailechen advises that a fish can be caught in the river. A salmon is then pulled out, and inside its stomach is the ring. This miracle saved the queen, and is immortalized today on the Glasgow coat of arms. The Merlin we recognize today was effectively engineered in the 1130s by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Geoffrey was a cleric writing the history of the kings of Britain. This is a massive pseudo-historical work designed to give the British people a glorious antiquity. To create a superstar wizard, Geoffrey merged the Welsh Merlin with another figure, a fatherless boy prophet named Ambrosius from the writings of Nennius. Geoffrey's first hurdle was the name. In Welsh, Merlin sounds dangerously close to the Anglo-Norman word for feces. To avoid having his great prophet laughed out of court, Geoffrey Latinized the name to Merlinus, changing the consonant and saving the character's dignity. Geoffrey then repurposed a story about a tower that wouldn't stand. The usurper King Vortigern tries to build a fortress, but the foundations collapse every night. His magicians claim he must sacrifice a boy without a father. Merlin is brought in and reveals the truth. The tower is collapsing because two dragons are fighting in a pool beneath the foundation. He drains the pool, revealing a red dragon, the Britons, and a white dragon, the Saxons. This prophecy gave a mythical framework to the Anglo-Saxon invasion and established Merlin as a political authority, not just a forest madman. Geoffrey also turned Merlin into a great engineer. He credits Merlin with building Stonehenge. When an army failed to move the stones with brute strength, Merlin used a system of levers and pulleys to set them up on Salisbury Plain. Other versions go heavier on the magic, with Merlin using his magic to bring giants under his command to move the huge stones. Interestingly, late in life, Geoffrey wrote Vita Merlini, a poem where he returned Merlin to his roots. He essentially retconned his own high fantasy wizard back into the traumatized wild man, complete with the laughing at shoes anecdote. It was an attempt to reconcile the courtly wizard he created with the authentic Welsh folklore he had previously ignored. As the legend crossed into France, it hit a theological wall. Arthur was a great Christian king, and his reliance on a wizard was highly questionable to audiences. Around 1200, the poet Robert de Boron solved this by rewriting Merlin's origin story to fit Christian doctrine. And trust me when I say it, this is where the story of Merlin really gets wild. He introduced the idea of the demonic patrimony. The story goes that the demons of hell were furious that Jesus Christ had redeemed so many souls. To counter this, they plotted to create their own prophet, an antichrist, so to speak. They sent an incubus to bring this monster to life, and the plan almost worked. But the mother of the half-demon child confessed to her priest immediately after the conception. The child, Merlin, was baptized the moment he was born. This baptism didn't remove his powers, but it neutralized his evil nature. From his demon father, Merlin inherited knowledge of everything past and present. From God, as a reward for his mother's piety and his baptism, he received knowledge of the future. This made him the ultimate advisor, possessing a 360-degree view of time. He wasn't a druid anymore. He was a sanctified half-demon working for the good guys, a fact that certainly didn't make it into the Disney film. Robert de Boron also connected Merlin to the Holy Grail. He established that Merlin created the Round Table as a copy of the Table of the Last Supper. He left one seat empty, the Siege Perilous, representing the betrayal of Judas, to be filled only by the Grail Knight. This shifted Merlin's role from a dynastic kingmaker to a spiritual guide preparing the kingdom for its holy quest. In the 13th century, French writers expanded the cast and introduced the element that would destroy Merlin: romance. The wild man had no time for dating, but the courtly enchanter needed a tragic flaw. In the Vulgate cycle, Merlin falls in love with Vivienne, the Lady of the Lake. He knows through his foresight that she will be his undoing, yet he is powerless to stop it, a feeling that I've felt at times in my life. He teaches her his magic during long walks in the forest. Vivienne then traps him in a tower of air, or invisible walls so she can keep him to herself. The post-Vulgate cycle takes a much darker turn. Here, Merlin is an old, lustful man harassing a young woman who wants to protect her chastity. She pries his secrets out of him for self-defense. When he takes her to a cave or a tomb to show her a marvel, she uses his own spell to seal him inside. In this version, he's buried alive or trapped under a rock, crying out in vain. It is a grim, tragic end that removes the wise advisor so the kingdom can slide into the chaos of Mordred's rebellion. This shift is crucial. It marks the transition of the legend from a story of rising empire to one of inevitable tragedy. Merlin's removal is the first domino in the fall of Camelot. Sir Thomas Malory, writing Le Morte d'Arthur in the 15th century, codified these versions into the narrative we know best. Malory emphasizes Merlin's role as a tester of character. Merlin often appears in disguise to see if Arthur and his knights will listen to wisdom regardless of the source. For instance, he will make himself appear as a teenaged boy and then give the wisest counsel possible, in hopes that Arthur can truly take the best advice. However, Malory is unsentimental about Merlin's end, and follows the post-Vulgate tradition, where Merlin gives in to his lustful and demonic nature. For his sins, the great sage ends up permanently trapped under a rock, with Arthur now left to rule alone without the wise counselor. Merlin didn't start as a wizard, but as a Welsh bard, who is much better attested than the vast majority of kings of the era. He was a survivor of a brutal Scottish battle, who fled into the trees to escape his memories. It took 600 years of literary evolution to drag him out of the woods, dress him in robes, and place him at the right hand of a king. He was molded by Geoffrey of Monmouth to legitimize British history, baptized by Robert de Boron to satisfy the church, and romanced by the French to entertain the court. Yet, the core of the character remains the same. Whether he is Merlin the mad bard or the half-demonic Merlin advising Arthur, he's the outsider. He's the figure who stands apart from humanity, seeing the doom that others ignore and providing whatever advice he can, whether people take heed of it or not. Hey everyone, just a quick reminder to hit that share button and send this video to 2 of your friends or family members who are interested in history. This is the absolute best way you can help my channel grow if you appreciate my work. It begins with a silence that screams. In the year 1984, archaeologists digging in the ruins of Aquae Sulis, modern-day Bath, uncovered a stark testament to the chaos of the 5th century. It was the skull of a young woman, stuffed unceremoniously into a Roman oven. This grisly discovery captures the terrifying reality of sub-Roman Britain. It was a world where the orderly grid of civilization had collapsed into darkness, and where the public baths had quite literally crumbled into swamps. But out of this anarchy, one moment of defiant light emerged. A singular event that halted the tide of the Anglo-Saxon conquest for a generation and birthed a legend that would haunt the imagination of the world forever. That event was the Siege of Mount Badon. We're looking for a battlefield. It is the site of the greatest victory won by the Britons, a triumph attributed by history to a desperate coalition of tribes led by a man named Arthur. Yet, despite its monumental importance, Mount Badon remains a ghost on the map. Our only contemporary guide to this violent epoch isn't a historian, but a fire and brimstone preacher named Gildas. Writing from a monastery cell in the 6th century, Gildas looked out at a Britain that was broken but currently at peace. In his polemic on the ruin and conquest of Britain, he rages against the sins of the British princes, viewing the Saxon invasions as divine punishment. But amidst his sermonizing, he drops a single golden anchor of fact: the Siege of Mount Badon. Gildas tells us this battle was the, quote, final victory of our country. a slaughter of the Saxon invaders that secured a generation of peace. Unfortunately, he didn't provide a date for when it happened, only indicating very precisely that it took place 44 years and 1 month prior. This, of course, made perfect sense in Gildas's reckoning, but he was writing in a time known as the British Dark Ages, and there's a 50-year period in which he may have been writing. Historians working from Gildas have determined the battle was likely around 500 AD, but nothing can be said with any certainty. Later chroniclers muddied the waters further. The Venerable Bede, writing centuries later, stripped the victory of its Arthurian connection entirely. It wasn't until the 9th century that the Historia Britannicum, attributed to Nennius, explicitly placed Arthur at the center of the action. Nennius lists Badon as Arthur's 12th and final battle, claiming the warlord slew 960 men in a single charge. While the body count is pure mythology, likely a poetic exaggeration of a tactical unit's strength, the significance is clear. By the 800s, Badon was the crown jewel of the budding Arthurian legend. The Annals of Wales push the date even later, to 516 AD, though it isn't clear how this date was derived. Despite the confusion of dates, the archaeological record confirms Gildas's central claim. Around the year 500 AD, the westward expansion of Saxon cemeteries abruptly stops, and for 50 years the frontier froze. The hunt for Badon is primarily a linguistic puzzle. The name Badon or Badonis is the only coordinate we have. For centuries, the most seductive theory has linked Badon to Bath. The Old English name for the city was Badham, at the baths, and the Welsh called it Caer Fadden. It seemed to be an obvious match. However, Celtic linguists would throw cold water on the theory, proposing numerous alternative names for various sites. If we follow the Bath theory, our eyes turn to the steep hills encircling Aquae Sulis, modern-day Bath. By 500 AD, the great Roman spa was a shadow of its former glory. The roof of the great bath may have already collapsed into the sacred spring. The city was likely largely abandoned, except for squatters and perhaps a local warlord's band of retainers. But strategically, Bath was, and is, a linchpin. It sits astride the Fosse Way, the arterial road connecting the southwest to the Midlands. Overlooking the city stands Little Salisbury Hill, a flat-topped eminence crowned by an Iron Age hill fort. It's a perfect defensive position. If a Saxon army had pushed west along the river valleys to seize the strategic crossing at Bath, a British army on Salisbury Hill would have been the anvil they struck. The siege described by Gildas fits the topography perfectly. The Britons trapped on the hill, the Saxons surrounding the slopes, until a breakout charge drove the invaders into the river. Medieval chroniclers like Geoffrey of Monmouth were certain Bath was the site. While we must be wary of Geoffrey's romancing, the persistence of the tradition is compelling. Travel south into the chalklands of Dorset, and you encounter a fortress that looks the part, Badbury Rings. This massive Iron Age fortification, with its multiple concentric ramparts, dominates the landscape near Wimborne Minster. Strategically, Badbury Rings is a vital choke point. It sits at the intersection of Roman roads leading to the coast and the interior. In the late 5th century, the West Saxons under Cerdic were likely pushing up from the Southampton area. To enter the heartlands of the British tribe known as the Durotriges, they had to pass Badbury. Unlike many other hill forts, Badbury Rings offers physical evidence of the struggle. Excavations have revealed that the ancient defenses were refurbished in the post-Roman period, bolstering this as the potential site. Move northeast along the spine of the ancient Ridgeway, and you find Liddington Castle in Wiltshire. This hill fort, often associated with a nearby village named Badbury, commands the high ground near modern Swindon. Liddington Castle sits on a geopolitical fault line. It overlooks the upper Thames Valley, which was one of the earliest areas of Saxon settlement. If the invaders wanted to push west toward the Severn and cut Britain in two, they had to come this way. Archaeology here is tantalizing. Excavations in 1976 uncovered pottery dating to the 5th and 6th centuries, proving the site was occupied exactly when Badon was fought. The ramparts were strengthened with timber and stone in a phase that corresponds to the Arthurian era. A victory here would have bottled up the Thames Valley Saxons for decades, matching the historical pause in expansion perfectly. We must also briefly consider the outliers. Some historians, noting Nennius's placement of Arthur's other battles in the north, argue it may have been in Scotland. However, the strategic reality of Badon fights against this. Gildas was concerned with the Saxon threat to the civilian centers of lowland Britain. A battle in Scotland, while possible for a northern warlord, would hardly have stopped the Saxon advance in Sussex and Wessex. Simply put, a British victory in the far north would do little to explain the halt of the Saxon menace in England. Regardless of the specific hill, we can reconstruct the terror of the siege. This was not a battle of shining knights. It was a gritty, desperate standoff. The British Comitatus, a professional corps of mounted warriors preserving the last scraps of Roman military doctrine, would have held the summit. Their leader was Arthur, or a man who would come to be known as such, and he wasn't a king but a war leader of a confederation of Romano-Britons and native Britons. They would have looked down on a sea of Saxon shields, men armed with ash spears and terrifying throwing axes. Gildas's mention of a siege implies the Britons were trapped. The 3 days and 3 nights mentioned in the annals suggests a stalemate broken by a decisive action. We can imagine the thirst, the smoke, and the final thunderous sortie. The British cavalry charging down the slopes, using the momentum of the hill to shatter the Saxon shield wall. It was a victory won not by Arthurian magic, but by iron and desperation. Ultimately, the exact location of Mount Badon may remain forever beneath the soil, guarded by the silence of the centuries. But its reality is etched into the timeline of Britain. For 50 years after the battle, the fires of the invasion dimmed. The British language, the Christian church, and the memory of Rome were given a stay of execution. Interestingly, this gap allowed the distinct identity of the Welsh to coalesce. It ensured that when the Saxons finally did conquer the lowlands, they couldn't erase the Celtic soul of the island completely.